Somewhere between morning light and the last quiet thought before sleep, there is a small, persistent feeling that often goes unnamed. It is not loud. It does not announce itself as fear or sadness. It feels more like a gentle pressure in the chest, a sense of falling behind something invisible. Many people carry it without speaking about it. They notice it when days slip by faster than expected, when plans dissolve quietly, when intention feels sincere yet movement feels delayed. It lives in the space between who someone imagines becoming and who they find themselves being in ordinary moments, not as failure, not as flaw, but as a quiet tension between desire and rhythm. And over time, this tension begins to feel personal, as if something inside has learned to hesitate, as if discipline itself has become emotionally distant, not resisted, just quietly unfamiliar. There's often a moment when the day begins to feel heavier than it should, not because anything terrible has happened, not because something has gone wrong. It feels heavier simply because something was meant to be done and quietly wasn't. The body still moved, messages were answered, rooms were crossed. Time continued without interruption. Yet beneath the surface of ordinary movement there is a thin, unspoken space, the place where intention was once held, and where action was expected to arrive. In that space there is rarely anger. There is no dramatic disappointment, only a quiet noticing, a small private recognition that something did not meet something else. People often carry this gap in silence. They may still appear organized. They may still speak about plans with clarity. But internally, the space between what was imagined and what unfolded begins to feel like a subtle emotional distance from themselves. Not guilt, not shame, more like a soft, persistent unfamiliarity. It can feel as though discipline belongs to another version of the self, a quieter, more orderly figure that lives just outside reach. Someone who wakes earlier, someone who follows through without friction, someone who seems to move in clean lines while real life feels curved and scattered. This imagined figure is not necessarily admired. Sometimes it is simply observed, like a reflection seen through glass that cannot be touched. And over time, the absence of that version begins to feel personal, not as a failure of effort, but as a quiet emotional separation. The world rarely names this separation. It is often disguised as procrastination, as distraction, as poor habits. Yet beneath those words is a gentler truth, a sense that something inside no longer fully trusts movement toward certain things. It is as if the body pauses before steps that once felt neutral, as if starting carries a weight that finishing no longer requires. There's a strange tenderness in this, a vulnerability that is rarely acknowledged, because what is being felt is not laziness. It is hesitation learned quietly over time. It is the echo of earlier moments when effort felt heavy, when expectation felt sharp, when doing was not emotionally safe. So the distance grows, not outward, but inward, between who someone means to be and who they experience themselves as being in ordinary hours. And that distance is not loud. It does not demand attention. It simply waits. A quiet gap, held between intention and motion, between inner hope and visible rhythm. And slowly, without drama, it becomes familiar, like a room that is always passed by but never entered. Long before discipline became a personal concern, it existed as a feeling in the room. It was present in voices that grew firmer when expectations were not met, in glances that lingered a little longer after mistakes, in praise that arrived only after something had been proven. For many, effort was not simply effort, it was also a signal, a way of being seen, a way of staying safe within emotional climates that rewarded performance more than presence. So the nervous system learned early, not in words but in sensation, that doing was tied to belonging. That movement carried emotional consequences. That rest was something that needed to be earned. Sometimes this learning was quiet. There were no raised voices, only subtle shifts in warmth, a gentler tone when tasks were completed, a slight coolness when they were not, and the body noticed, not as a thought, but as a pattern of feeling. Over time, discipline began to carry more than responsibility. It carried memory, the memory of being watched, of being evaluated, of being worthy only in motion. So something protective formed. Not resistance, not rebellion, but hesitation, a gentle slowing at the edge of effort, a quiet leaning away from tasks that once carried emotional weight. Not because the tasks were difficult, but because they were emotionally loud. Even in adulthood, this memory remains. Not in words, not in stories that can be easily told. It lives in the chest, in the breath that changes slightly when beginning something important, in the subtle tightness that appears before a deadline is opened, in the invisible pause before starting. This is how the body remembers earlier climates. Discipline begins to feel like standing in a familiar room that once required performance to remain safe, and the nervous system, still protective, gently hesitates, not to sabotage, not to avoid life, but to protect a quieter sense of self that once learned that effort came with emotional cost. So what looks like distraction is often tenderness. What looks like delay is often memory. What looks like a lack of structure is sometimes a nervous system choosing softness over pressure. And the quiet gap deepens, not because something is broken, but because something is still remembering. Remembering climates, remembering expectations, remembering what effort once meant, and holding that memory quietly in the body. Inside the body, there's a system that speaks in sensation rather than language. It does not analyze. It does not reason. It simply remembers what once felt safe and what once felt costly. Every experience leaves a faint imprint, not as a clear picture, but as a bodily tone, a quiet leaning toward or away from certain sensations. Effort, over time, becomes more than movement. It becomes a feeling, a temperature, a pressure in the chest, a tightening around the breath. So when a person sits down to begin something, even something they care about, the body does not ask whether it is meaningful. It asks whether it feels familiar, whether it feels safe. If earlier effort was paired with emotional strain, the nervous system learned to mark that sensation as something to approach carefully. Not because it is dangerous, but because it once required vigilance. So the pause appears, not as conscious choice, not as defiance, as a subtle withdrawal of energy. As the body choosing a softer sensation over a sharper one. Scrolling feels lighter, daydreaming feels quieter. Small, neutral tasks feel emotionally gentler. Not because they are easier, but because they are less emotionally charged. This is how avoidance is born quietly. Not as laziness, but as a preference for nervous system softness. Even ambition becomes filtered through sensation. The mind may imagine future versions, but the body remembers past climates. So the present moment becomes a negotiation between meaning and memory, between desire and safety. And when safety wins, it does not announce itself. It simply leans toward what feels quieter inside. This is why discipline can feel distant even when goals feel sincere. Because discipline is not just behavior, it is a sensation the body has learned to interpret. And interpretation happens below thought, below intention, below language. It lives in breath patterns, in muscle tone, in subtle emotional weather. So the quiet gap continues. Not as a moral issue, not as a character flaw, but as a nervous system choosing familiarity over emotional sharpness. And in that choice, something gentle is happening. The body is protecting a sense of self that once learned that effort came with invisible costs. Not loudly, not dramatically, just softly. In the quiet, ordinary moments where intention waits and movement hesitates. There's often a private moment when the distance becomes noticeable, not because anything has failed, but because something inside grows tired of carrying the quiet weight of hesitation. It may appear in the early morning when light touches the edges of rooms, or late at night when the world has become still enough for inner movements to be felt. In those moments, the quiet gap is no longer abstract. It feels like a gentle sadness, not heavy, just present. A recognition that the distance between intention and motion has been lived inside for a long time. And sometimes, without planning, something softens. Not as a decision, not as a declaration, but as a noticing. A noticing that discipline has never been about force. It has always been about sensation. About how movement feels inside a body that remembers. This noticing does not erase memory. It does not remove the emotional climate of earlier years. But it allows space for a quieter relationship to form. Discipline begins to appear less like a strict figure standing in the distance and more like a tone, a rhythm, a feeling that can be approached slowly. The body starts to recognize movement not as a test, but as a presence, not as something that demands, but as something that simply exists. And in that recognition, the nervous system does not rush, it does not perform, it listens. Listens to whether effort can feel less sharp, whether motion can feel less loud, whether being in movement can feel emotionally quieter than being in pause. There is no sudden change, only small internal shifts. The breath softening slightly before beginning, the shoulders lowering just a little, the chest no longer tightening in the same way. These are not achievements, they are not milestones. They are quiet emotional weather changes. And in those changes, discipline is no longer distant. It is no longer a symbol of pressure. It is simply a feeling that is becoming less unfamiliar. Not fully comfortable, not fully safe, just less foreign. And it is enough to change the inner landscape gently, not into certainty, not into clarity, but into something quieter, a soft awareness that the body is not resisting life, it has only been remembering. Remembering climates, remembering tones, remembering what once felt costly, and now slowly beginning to recognize that movement can feel different. Not because something has been fixed, not because anything has been solved, but because something inside has begun to feel seen. And in that seeing, the quiet gap does not disappear. It simply becomes gentler, like a space that no longer feels empty, just quietly waiting, holding breath, letting time move around it and remaining, not as an obstacle, but as a place where something softer is learning how to exist.